Good afternoon. Welcome to a session on software security, trust, and public policy. You've heard a lot of really great news this morning about supporting the open source ecosystem and enabling software development to scale while keeping software secure. And throughout the rest of the day, you're going to be hearing more sessions on more tools and best practices for doing open source well and great, both in the community and in enterprises, and even using open source for good. Since this is a session on policy, I think it's acceptable to, and everybody's excited about these new tools and best practices and how they can deploy them like right now in your day-to-day jobs. However, this is a session on policy, so I want to look, I think I have permission to look ahead a little bit. I'm really excited about how these new tools and practices and support for the open source ecosystem are going to play out over the next, say, 10 years. It's going to be amazing. Who knows what's going to happen? However, something else is going to play out in that kind of time frame that's also going to profoundly impact what developers build, how secure the software they build is going to be, and really what developers' career paths are going to be. And that is developments in public policy. So I'm incredibly pleased that we're able to have this session at Satellite, where we're going to try to talk about kind of the themes of the conference around the developers connecting with each other, but also with the world, and that includes policy, security, and open source, and look at them from the frame of public policy, which is not something that's completely obscure, and in fact, developers can get involved in and be informed about. And I should say, I'm Mike Linksvayer from the GitHub policy team, and kind of our hypothesis about the world is that the more developers and policymakers talk to each other and understand each other, the better policies we'll get, the more secure software we'll get, and indeed the more secure society we'll get. And I'm even more pleased to have with me on stage Marietje Schaake, a member of European Parliament from the Netherlands, in fact, just arrived by plane from Amsterdam after voting in the European Parliament elections, and is really an expert in cybersecurity policy and internet policy and human rights and other things that are kind of adjacent to that. Has been serving in the European Parliament since 2009, has been extremely influential on these issues, and not only in parliaments, but also in the press with columns in the Financial Times, Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal, and also serving on many organizations that relate to cybersecurity and human rights. And if I know how to use the clicker, whoops, this seems to be out of, okay, great. So you can see Marietje's Twitter profile up there. Feel free to tweet about the session, use the hashtag GitHub policy. And so welcome, Marietje.
Thank you, it's really good to be here. Nice European color schemes too in the room, so that's nice.
Thanks. And you can also see one of Marietje's columns in the press. This is with Financial Times. I pulled from your homepage about how governments must halt the spread of commercial spyware. So this is really just indicative of how you're influencing the conversation in a very kind of informed way. So I want to, basically the structure of this conversation is I want to talk about a couple of case studies about how policy has been helping to secure open software, secure open source and other software, and then where policy has been kind of a threat to the robustness of the software ecosystem, and then some broader context for the long-term role of policy and even geopolitics in having a secure world that we can ship software in. But I want to start by just asking, what was your path to becoming a cybersecurity policy expert and really interested in internet policy, et cetera?
So it started at the University of Amsterdam, where I was actually really curious and not quite finding in my studies of sociology and American studies what I wanted to do. And there was a very new minor at the time, so a small field of specialization called new media. And this was more than 20 years ago, so revealing my age a little bit there. But this really allowed me to be introduced to the sort of connections between technological development, the emergence of the World Wide Web, globalization, and what it meant for people, society, and human rights, fundamental freedoms. I'm not a beta thinker, I'm not an engineer, I'm not a coder, but I try to look at where technology reaches and what implications it has for people. And since then I've continued to visit hacker conferences. I've been helped enormously by people like yourselves who have taken the time to sit with someone like me to allow me to ask stupid questions. And it's just basically by keeping track and by caring about this topic and what the impact of tech is on values and rights.
Right. And keeping track of and caring, that's something that I think that developers and technologists more broadly need to do in your space, basically, about policy.
Well, yeah, I'm convinced that if we could bring the worlds of governance, politics, and technology development, cybersecurity, closer together, that would be better for everyone. And I mean, I think the sort of alienation is mutual sometimes, right? A very good friend of mine, Andrew Roche, always says, politicians don't know the difference between a server and a waiter. And unfortunately, I think that's often true, but on the other hand, a lot of people in tech are not very familiar, to put it mildly, with how democratic processes work, what is the best moment to intervene in a lawmaking process, what language do you speak in order to build a constituency, to build a coalition, to reach those lawmakers that may not already be on board. I mean, ideally, you would have someone sitting here who's not working on cybersecurity, who knows how to find a conference like GitHub, and who's going to be open-minded to what is going on in the world of open source. So I think we all, on the policy side, on the political side, but also on the tech side, would benefit a great deal from opening our real-life bubble and sharing knowledge with each other in a constructive way.
Right. So continuing to kind of ask about your involvement in cybersecurity policy, particularly, I put up on the screen the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, which you serve on, and their mission statement, which really which you might not want to read word for word now, but really kind of contextualizes the challenge of the stability of cyberspace, which certainly developers depend on to ship, as almost a geopolitical kind of thing.
Yeah.
But it's not, I think everyone at least understands that legislation happens even if they don't understand the mechanics maybe. But what role do groups like the Global Commission on Stability of Cyberspace play? And I imagine that you must think it's a compelling one because you serve on it.
No, I'm really excited about this group. It's a group of experts from all different walks of life and all different parts of the world. So truly people who bring their own expertise, their own sense of which values are the most important. And we are there to basically bridge the gap between what is happening in real life, tensions between countries, sometimes the compromising of technology or private sector companies, non-state actors using technologies for attacks, for undermining trust, for geopolitical goals, etc., etc. And on the other hand, the sort of heavy process of lawmaking or even the development of international law and international procedures. So the Global Commission is actually trying to put forward proposals that are not law, but that are in the realm of norms. So they're softer than law, but they're designed to be a common denominator where states, private sector companies, civil society actors, cybersecurity experts, NGOs can find each other in a common interest. For example, one of the proposed norms, and we would actually very much welcome your feedback on all the proposed norms, but I think specifically this one might be interesting for your community, is that we propose a norm of protecting the public core of the open internet. In other words, all the infrastructure, routers, domain name systems that are fundamental for everything to, cross over the web, to not be a space for attack. So essentially to consider it like a neutral zone, in the same way that countries can consider themselves neutral in a war, to basically say once this becomes a theater for conflict, which it is of course gradually becoming, then there's only one direction, which is a race to the bottom, and it will actually equally impact countries like China and the United States. It will equally impact the average internet user and a big corporation, and this is not the direction we want to go in. And there's a whole set of norms. We have, I think, 7 now, ranging from a norm around electoral integrity and the role of technology, but also supply chains. I think it's a hot topic these days. How do private companies make sure that the software and hardware as well are not commandeered, are not manipulated, are not instrumentalized for attacks? So I think it's an effort to raise the bar of norms, of good behavior, and getting different stakeholders to agree.
Okay, fantastic. If we have time, I want to kind of come back to the norms thing at the end.
Yeah.
So I want to move on to a case study where the EU in particular, government, is doing some things to help improve open source security. And there's a program called FOSSA that you've actually been involved in enabling. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So one observation was that in the market we saw a lot of bug bounty programs and incentives for hackers to use their knowledge towards the greater good instead of selling to the highest bidder, who could also be a criminal network or worse. But there's now increasingly bug bounty programs by big corporations like Microsoft and others. There are now platforms for bug bounties. I'm sure you're all familiar with these. But in the open source space, there are different incentives. There's not such a market-driven incentive. And so what we wanted to do is to create a little budget and especially create awareness, to be honest, on the part of the European Commission, which is obviously a huge buyer and user of software, whether it's proprietary or open source software. So to really start the thinking about what can the Commission and what can governments more broadly do as the buyers in these markets to kick into place procedures where hackers are also rewarded and recognized, more importantly sometimes than remunerated, when they fix a bug or identify a vulnerability in open source software. And so we created this as what is called a pilot project, which is basically kind of like a startup in policy. You really want to kickstart a process, make some budget available, and it's been a big success already. There have been hackathons organized, and even though the people responsible in the European Commission were a little bit apprehensive at first, this often happens when they have to deal with new things, they are now the most excited about being part of this process, and I really encourage you to look at it. It's about open source, so it should really meet your world and your expertise, and I hope it can begin to bridge this larger gap between tech experts, security experts, and policymakers to think about the most economically smart, security smart, but also democratically smart, essentially, way of working with software. And that's how I see open source software, as the more democratic way of working with technology.
Great, so do I. So I want to ask a follow-up to that. I wonder if there are other programs in the EU that relating to open source or cybersecurity that developers really ought to be aware of. And I want to highlight I just put up on the screen an excerpt from a European Commission slide deck on open source strategy. And I think the interesting thing for people in this audience might be that it will be very familiar for anybody who's thought about kind of open source maturity in the enterprise, where you start to use open source, maybe you don't even know you're using open source, and then you're purposefully using it, and then you're producing it and contributing, and you hope that it's going to contribute to transforming your enterprise. Well, government, at least a forward-thinking government, entity like the European Commission actually has the same strategy. So I wonder, are there other ways for developers to kind of engage either with EU institutions on this kind of strategy?
Definitely. So I'm convinced that we're going to see, for better or worse, but that we're going to see a lot of tech policy decisions being made in the next couple of years. I think on content moderation, who decides what stays up, what goes down, questions of intermediary liability exemptions, there's going to be a lot of policies developed. And if we don't want to see a repetition of the copyright directive that I think has disappointed many of us in this room, then it really helps to get engaged in a broad sense. So basically to start thinking about what are important aspects of technological developments to share, what are areas where open source can make a difference, how can you all be a part of sharing knowledge with lawmakers so that when the time comes, and for example the e-commerce directive is going to be renegotiated, or the Cybersecurity Act, which has just been adopted, is going to be reviewed or whatever, that you don't start from scratch but that you build on a sort of broader knowledge foundation. And there's a lot to look at. I mentioned the Cybersecurity Act, but there's also recommendations in there for vulnerability disclosure on the part of governments and on the part of private sector companies, where when you look at the European landscape, there's an enormous difference. There are countries like my own, which is a coincidence, but also France, that have fairly sophisticated vulnerability disclosure mechanisms, but there's also countries that are still beginning to grasp the importance of this process. And so from a European point of view, it's good to do this in a harmonized way, but from a national or even local point of view, it's also important that people that are responsible for these decisions see why it matters. So I believe that from the policy angle, from the implementation of policy angle, and from a sort of general interest perspective, it would be really good to see more and even more systematic exchanges between communities like yours, the open source community, and lawmakers.
Okay, fantastic. You mentioned that many people here probably didn't like the outcome of the copyright directive.
I'm happy to see hands for people who were thrilled by it, but
so
no one's raising their hand.
That's actually what I want to talk about next. We were talking about ways that government could kind of help make the software ecosystem more robust, for example, by doing things like bug bounties. So now a copyright directive is actually a case study in how policy potentially makes the software ecosystem more fragile. And I put up on the screen GitHub's initial blog post where we sort of highlighted the potential threats to the software ecosystem, and the console readout that you see there is not real, fortunately, but the idea is potentially if software development platforms had been fallen under this directive, then potentially automated filtering would have been necessary, and that really could have made the software ecosystem more fragile, because it could have, your critical security fix might have been blocked because it's a false positive to this filter that we were forced to implement. So we put out a call to developers, and actually we had a lot of developers, particularly who contribute to open source, who actually wrote to their MEPs, including some who are involved in the negotiations around the directive, and said, hey, the software industry is just not pertinent to this. You really want to go after social media platforms maybe, but this is only going to harm us. And they actually listened. But of course, that doesn't mean that what was actually passed, even though fortunately this exclusion actually made it into the final legislation, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have any harms, or that something like it where software development is inadvertently targeted isn't going to happen again. So I wonder if you can say something about, I don't know, how that all happened and maybe lessons for developers going forward.
Yeah. So I think the copyright directive will go down in history as one of the decisions with most unintended consequences and with most derailed lobbying on both sides, I should say, because some of the emails that you sent, thank you for that, there were quite a few. And it irritated a lot of people. And some of them were, of course, automatically sent through or whatever because they included exactly the same words, which is usually kind of a hint for lawmakers to see that there's, that they're steered centrally and that it's not citizen by citizen who is writing the same letter. But also from the part of the publishing houses, from the movie producers, the music industry. I mean, it was really a tragic display of promises, that democracy would be saved, that the free media would be saved, all by copyright. Well, and I think history doesn't have such a great track record of all the positive impact that copyright protection has really brought the world. So I would have liked to see this law pass without filtering requirements effectively, even though it's not there in wording, and without an additional copyright protection for publishers. I think it is justified to update the copyright protection. It's an outdated law. Technology changes very fast. It can also be enabling for companies to reach larger audiences, but the intentions must have been good. I have no doubt to challenge my colleagues on that, but I think that the execution was horrendous. And probably one of the reasons is that in the absence of a better understanding of how the internet works, what an upload filter really is, who could be caught in the net unintendedly, in the absence of a deeper understanding of how these technologies work, how the internet works, promises by lobby groups on both sides started to lead their own life. And so it was really hard to roll that back when voting time came. It had been quite an entrenched debate, so it was hard for politicians to sort of climb down from a position that they had taken, even though some of them privately came to me and said, I think I made the wrong decision.
Right.
So I think this really goes to show that having a broader discussion about how tech works and anticipating laws earlier on, building trust with lawmakers who sometimes have a certain image in their minds when they hear the word hacker, when they hear the word coding. I mean, I've heard some people referring to their inboxes being hacked just because they received so many emails, which it could have still been hacked, but it's not necessarily shown by a number of emails coming in. So
right.
There's still a lot of work to do. Also to show that hackers can have very good intentions and constructive contributions to make to democracy, society, etc.
Right, absolutely. So staying on the copyright directive for a moment, because it's not over actually, there's a process of transposing the directive into national law, which to somebody from the US like myself, it's pretty unfamiliar, but it's how a directive works. So that will probably be, the exact implementation will probably be continued to be lobbied around. And there's I think
there will be a lot of prosecution and legal cases around this, which I think is very unfortunate. I mean, I think the copyright directive was the best result for lawyers, to be honest, because this ambiguity between the European decision and the implementation on the member state level will no doubt be used for all kinds of litigation.
Right. So there's a statement by some member states that was published, and I actually first became aware of it through your Twitter feed, actually. And the statement by Germany is actually particularly interesting and good. And I put up on the screen two little brief excerpts that I think are worth discussing really quickly. So one, just that they are, talk about how important the exclusion of software development platforms and encyclopedias like Wikipedia is, so they're not under this regime. But the other, perhaps even more interesting one, is that to the extent there are technical measures required, that the EU should invest in open source development around them. I think that's quite interesting maybe, because even though we might not like upload filters or maybe similar mandates that come with other regulation, if in fact they're potentially impactful to democratic discourse, wouldn't it be good if, and we want even small platforms to have them, wouldn't it be good if there were shared technologies that did not kind of create competitive moats and also allowed journalists, researchers to actually look at the implementation? So it's kind of interesting that the German statement highlighted that. I wondered if you have any thoughts about kind of open source becoming a part of the policy toolbox around transparency and competition that maybe could be more frequently reached to?
Yeah, I think you touch on a much broader point, which is really where in today's world, where digitization often means privatization, is the public interest protected? And even if some of the policy processes lead to results that not everybody's happy about, the effort, I believe, is entirely legitimate to make sure that the rule of law also applies online, and that principles like non-discrimination, fair competition, access to information, et cetera, are upheld somehow. And I think that open source, as I mentioned before, is sort of the more democratic way, the more public interest way of dealing with challenges and digitization. So yes, I see a big role there, but I believe there's a lot of steps that could be taken and should be taken on the part of governments to recognize much more what their own role is as sending tenders and procurement into the market, setting the terms of reference for a number of developments, as well as making laws. So I think bringing these communities closer together, and also to hear from the open source community in slightly more layman's terms what can be done. Because one of the great things about people like you is that you are experts, geeks, you know a lot of stuff about very specific things. But that doesn't mean that people understand what you're talking about when you're explaining it. And so what we need to do is bridge these gaps. I often feel like a bit of an interpreter, trying to frame certain debates that I hear in communities like yours or at Chaos Computer Club or other techie conferences, and then to think about, if I had to explain this to, let's say, the equivalent of my mother, where would I begin? And I think that is what is more needed in order to get much better results, because a lot of the terminology, even open source, I think a lot of people don't even really know what that is.
Right.
Yeah.
That is all too true. And you said the word non-discrimination in there, so that's a great segue, because I want to take the opportunity of having you here to also ask you about something that isn't directly related to security, but is about kind of securing the policy ecosystem to allow developers to compete on a level playing field and not have to ask permission to ship new products. And you can probably guess what that is. It's
export controls? Net neutrality.
Network neutrality, right? And so I think that you played kind of a key role in ensconcing the EU's network neutrality regulation, and also very interesting, you did some kind of cross-border advocacy and led this letter that I have up on the screen that I believe 148 of your colleagues signed, encouraging the US to do the same. So I wonder if you could say a few words about how, I also wanted to mention the European Commission also just published a study basically saying that all stakeholders are fine with network neutrality in the EU. And I wonder what developers in other parts of the world that maybe don't have that could learn from your experience.
Yeah, so I think the example of net neutrality is a really good one, also building on what we just discussed, trying to get concepts to be understood by larger groups of people. So net neutrality for the longest time was this technical term that a lot of my colleagues thought like, okay, yeah, I don't know what she's doing, is probably not very relevant, so we don't have to understand the details of net neutrality. But by framing it as rules of the road for the digital economy, or as fair competition online, more people, also those who care about competition issues or who care about the digital economy or digital single market, as well as people who care about the preservation of the open internet, started to see that it also mattered to the things that they wanted to achieve. And it was a tough battle, just like the copyright one. I mean, the telcos initially were not very thrilled to see net neutrality. In fact, it was one of the reasons why we started to discuss it at all, because telecom operators were throttling or even cutting off access to voice over IP competition, which is obviously not allowed. One, because they're not allowed to look at where you're surfing, whether you're going to use WhatsApp or Skype or whatever. And two, because they cannot use their privileged position of providing access to the internet, for example, to discriminate against which website you want to go to. And that is what we have now put in European law. And I'm glad that the players have stopped complaining. I mean, I'm not sure that they're very happy, but I guess they're respecting the law, which is a very normal thing. And I wish that in the US it could stay as is or as was agreed before it got undermined again by the FCC.
Right. Well, we're working on that. So I want to move back to sort of broader norms and even geopolitics, and I want to do that by highlighting a paper that you've published in the Georgetown Journal of International Affairs called "A Rules-Based Order to Keep the Internet Open and Secure." And who could argue with a title like that?
Well, that's good. Most people would probably find this fairly boring, but thank you.
It's really not. I actually it's quite short. I want to say 10 to 12 pages, and it's quite readable. So I encourage you to look this up. It's actually a really interesting framing for kind of what's happening in the world of technology and policy today. And I want to try to give you my takeaway from it, and we can see how it goes from there.
Yeah.
So I mean, basically the US and the EU have typically at least advocated for a rules-based internet order, international order, and specifically a rules-based internet. But over the last few years, they've kind of backed away, or we've kind of backed away from that because we see the internet as something to be feared now, not necessarily something to be fostered. And into that gap, we have kind of alternative models that are liked by authoritarian regimes. And there are how do we get back to appropriate regulation, good regulation, but that defends this rules-based order and makes it global. And there are precedents for doing that. So do I have the sort of outline of the arguments close to rights? And I wonder, how can developers actually act on this, kind of first-order geopolitical thing that seems very detached at the nation-state level, but in fact profoundly impacts, whether they'll be able to collaborate across borders in the future, like is taken for granted now, never mind ship product across borders.
Exactly. So I think what we've seen very broadly, that's what I'm trying to also highlight in the article, is that traditionally, so let's imagine pre-internet, democracies, European countries, United States, some other countries, have believed in the notion that the rule of law is sacred, that people's rights and freedoms and some principles need to be protected. But strangely enough, despite some sound bites, like an internet freedom strategy that Hillary Clinton rolled out, etc., there has not been a fundamental transposing or extension of this rules-based order to the online digital world. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One, I'm sure you all know the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace of John Perry Barlow, but this sort of libertarian ideology with which the development of the World Wide Web started. This notion that it was a different space, that governments couldn't touch it, and in fact that it was better that way. And the regulation that has been there have been tax exemptions under Bill Clinton, have been this intermediary liability exception, without which the internet would not look the way it looks today. So I believe there has gradually, because of some ideals in an isolated context, namely of Silicon Valley, there has been an absence of rules and principles articulated by the democracies of this world. And another argument that we often heard, I still hear today, is don't regulate the internet because otherwise China will do the same. Well, I wish China would listen to us because then we would be in a more democratic place, altogether. Human rights would be more respected, etc. But the fact of the matter is that while we, let's say the democracies of this world, have not been as ambitious in developing the rule of law online, China and other authoritarian governments have been much more articulate, ambitious, and principled in rolling out their system of governance. And in the meantime, of course, not to be ignored, a number of private companies are effectively setting norms. Whatever Facebook decides it's going to leave online is norm setting because people can or cannot see it. Same goes for YouTube, Google, and the other big tech platforms. So in other words, I believe it is high time that democracies step up and that the rule of law becomes a leading concept again. And that is what I would like to leave you with, because I see red flashes here, we're out of time, stress. But that the rule of law and protecting it, including through regulation, I fundamentally believe is a legitimate goal. And for people who are developing new technologies and who are sometimes in a good way pressing the boundaries a bit of what is possible, to think about how the rule of law serves all of us, whether you're in the open source community, in the private sector, in civil society, in government, because it is the foundation of our freedoms. And I really hope and believe that when the tech community and governments work together better, we can make a more robust and resilient kind of open internet that also protects our democracy and the rule of law. So I hope we can work on that together. And I'm sorry we don't have more time to talk about it.
Okay, fantastic. That's a fantastic way to end the conversation. I encourage you to continue the conversation. You can follow Marietje Schaake on Twitter. You can also follow GitHub Policy. And I encourage you to also cultivate more politicians and policymakers in your mold, really. Talk to your representatives and local policymakers.
Vote, please.
Yes. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.